The coffee in Natalie Chen's hands had gone cold hours ago, but she still gripped the mug like it was the only solid thing left in her crumbling world. Outside her apartment window, the Seattle rain fell in sheets, matching the tears that had finally stopped streaming down her face. 6 hours earlier, she had walked out of Cascade Financial Group, carrying a banker's box filled with 3 years of her professional life and a termination letter that made her question everything she thought she knew about fairness and dignity. The reason for her firing still echoed in her mind like a cruel joke. Your presence has become problematic for workplace dynamics. Several employees have expressed concerns about distraction. We feel it's best if we part ways. Natalie had stared at Patricia Morrison, the head of human resources, unable to process the words. She had never received anything but excellent performance reviews. She had brought in major accounts and mentored junior staff. She dressed conservatively and kept her interactions professional. But none of that mattered because Patricia, along with several senior managers, had decided that Natalie's appearance was somehow her fault and their problem. The truth was simpler and uglier than the corporate language suggested. Natalie was 28, intelligent, and yes, conventionally attractive. That combination had made certain people uncomfortable from the day she started. The whispers had begun small. Comments about her clothes being too fitted, even when they were identical to what other women wore. Suggestions that she was using her looks to get ahead, even though she worked longer hours than anyone else. Cold shoulders from female colleagues who saw her as competition rather than a teammate. Now sitting in her tiny apartment with rent due in 2 weeks and student loans that never seemed to shrink, Natalie felt the weight of an unfair world pressing down on her shoulders. She had done everything right. Graduated top of her class. Worked multiple jobs to pay her way through college. Treated everyone with respect and kindness. And still it wasn't enough because someone else's insecurity had more power than her accomplishments. The next morning, Natalie forced herself out of bed and began the depressing task of job hunting. But after a dozen applications, she realized that without a reference from her most recent employer, her prospects were grim. Cascade Financial was one of the biggest firms in Seattle, and Patricia had made it clear that any reference would be neutral at best. In the corporate world, neutral meant problem employee. By the end of the week, Natalie had burned through most of her savings. She needed income immediately. Swallowing her pride, she applied for temporary positions that had nothing to do with her finance degree. She took a job as a receptionist at a medical building downtown. The pay was a fraction of what she had earned, but it would keep the lights on while she figured out her next move. The medical building was older and worn around the edges but clean. On her first day, Natalie met the small staff, including the building manager, the security guard, and the maintenance worker. The maintenance worker was a man who looked to be in his 60s with silver hair and weathered hands. He introduced himself simply as Bill and went back to replacing light bulbs in the hallway. Natalie noticed Bill over the following weeks because he seemed to be everywhere. He was there before she arrived in the morning and still working when she left at night. He fixed leaky faucets, cleaned the common areas, and somehow managed to know every tenant in the building by name. What struck Natalie most was the way he treated everyone with the same quiet respect, whether they were doctors or delivery drivers. One afternoon during her lunch break, Natalie sat on a bench outside the building, trying to stretch her meager sandwich into a full meal. Her stomach rumbled, but she had to make her grocery budget last until payday. Bill sat down on the other end of the bench with his own lunch, a simple thermos of soup and some crackers. "Mind if I join you? The old benches are better shared than solitary." Natalie smiled and nodded. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Bill spoke again. "You look like someone carrying a heavy load. Not my business, of course, but sometimes talking to a stranger helps lighten the weight." Something about his gentle manner made Natalie's defenses crumble. She found herself telling him everything. The firing, the humiliation, the fear that she would never recover her career. Bill listened without interruption, his eyes kind and attentive. "That's a hard thing to carry. Being punished for something that isn't wrong. I've seen a lot in my years, and I can tell you that people who make decisions based on their own insecurities, rather than someone's character, always reveal themselves eventually. The question is whether you'll let their judgment become your truth." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you know your worth isn't defined by people who were afraid of you. You know you worked hard and did right by others. Don't let them take that knowledge from you. Keep doing the next right thing and trust that eventually the right people will see what the wrong people refuse to acknowledge." Natalie felt tears prick her eyes. This maintenance worker who barely knew her had offered more wisdom and kindness than anyone from her old life. Over the following weeks, she and Bill developed an unexpected friendship. They would share lunch on the bench and Bill would tell stories from his long life. He had worked dozens of jobs and met thousands of people. He spoke about business and finance with surprising knowledge, but always brushed off Natalie's questions about his background. Just picked things up along the way. You learn a lot when you pay attention and keep your mouth shut. 3 months into her receptionist job, Natalie received a call that made her heart stop. It was a recruiter from Morrison Enterprises, one of the largest investment firms on the West Coast. They wanted to interview her for a senior analyst position. The salary and benefits were extraordinary, but Natalie was confused. She hadn't applied to Morrison Enterprises and couldn't understand how they even knew about her. The interview was scheduled for the following week. Natalie used her last bit of savings to buy a new interview suit and prepared more thoroughly than she had for anything in her life. When the day came, she took the elevator to the top floor of the Morrison building, her stomach twisted in knots. The receptionist led her past a series of impressive offices to a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. And there, rising from behind a massive desk in an elegant suit, was Bill. Natalie's mind went blank. The maintenance worker from her building stood before her, transformed yet somehow exactly the same. His kind eyes held the same warmth, but now carried the weight of authority. "Please sit down, Natalie. I imagine you have questions." Natalie sank into the chair, speechless. Bill, or whoever he really was, sat down across from her and folded his hands on the desk. "My full name is William Morrison. I built this company from nothing 40 years ago. But somewhere along the way I realized that sitting in an office surrounded by yes men, I had lost touch with the reality of how my businesses actually operated. So several times a year I go work in one of the buildings my company owns. I do maintenance or cleaning or security. I work alongside people who have no idea who I am. And I watch how they treat each other when they think nobody important is paying attention. You were testing me. No, I was seeing you. There's a difference. Tests are artificial. Real character shows up in everyday moments. I saw you treat everyone in that building with respect. I watched you help the older doctor carry his files when his hands were full. I heard you encourage the young medical student who was worried about her exams. I noticed you always cleaned up your own lunch area and asked the security guard about his daughter's wedding. You did those things not because anyone was watching, but because that's who you are." Natalie felt overwhelmed. "But why did you let me struggle? Why didn't you help me sooner?" Bill's expression became serious. "Because easy answers don't teach us what we need to know. You needed to discover that your worth isn't tied to a job title or salary. You needed to learn that kindness isn't strategic, it's fundamental. And you needed to see that doing the next right thing, even when everything feels hopeless, builds the foundation for everything that comes after. Those weren't lessons I could give you. You had to live them." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an offer letter with numbers that made Natalie's eyes widen. But more than the salary, the position would put her in charge of ethical investment strategies for the entire company. She would have the authority to ensure that Morrison Enterprises invested in businesses that treated their employees with dignity and fairness. I also took the liberty of making some calls. Cascade Financial Group has been removed from our approved partners list. Patricia Morrison is no longer employed there. Turns out when I started asking questions, a pattern emerged of her targeting successful young women she perceived as threats. Several other victims came forward. The company is now under investigation and implementing major reforms. Natalie's hands shook as she held the offer letter. This wasn't just a job. This was vindication. This was justice. This was someone with real power using it to lift people up instead of tearing them down. But more than that, this was proof that doing the next right thing mattered even when it felt pointless. All those small acts of kindness she had shown to strangers had been witnessed by someone who understood their value. The maintenance worker had been the owner all along, not just of buildings but of a philosophy. The character revealed itself in how we treated people when we gained nothing from being kind. I don't know what to say except thank you, not just for this opportunity but for seeing me when I felt invisible. Bill smiled and stood, offering his hand. You were never invisible, Natalie. You just needed to find people worthy of seeing you clearly. 6 months later, Natalie stood in front of a conference room full of Morrison Enterprises executives presenting her new ethical investment framework. She had built a team of brilliant analysts and created policies that prioritize companies treating employees fairly. Under her leadership, Morrison Enterprises had become known not just for financial returns, but for social responsibility. Bill attended her presentation sitting quietly in the back. When she finished, he stood and applauded. The room joined him in recognition of work that mattered beyond profit margins. That evening, Natalie returned to her old medical building. She wanted to thank Bill properly in the place where their friendship had begun. She found him on the bench outside where they had shared so many lunches. "You didn't have to come back here. I wanted to. This place reminded me that every job has dignity and every person has worth. You taught me that the measure of success isn't how high we climb, but how many people we help along the way." Bill nodded, his eyes reflecting the setting sun. The world needs more people who understand that. Use your position well, Natalie. See people the way you were seen. Lift others the way you were lifted. As Natalie walked away from that old building toward her new life, she thought about how differently things had turned out from that terrible day she was fired. She had been judged, dismissed, and discarded by people who should have known better. But she had also been seen, valued, and elevated by someone who understood that true leadership means recognizing worth in others. The janitor had been the owner all along, watching to see who remained kind when kindness seemed pointless. And in that watching, he had changed everything. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones seeing us most clearly. Sometimes losing everything is the beginning of gaining what we truly deserve. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remain true to our values, even when the world seems determined to punish us for them. Because eventually the right people notice. Eventually, character wins. Eventually, kindness comes back around. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Kindify Stories for more tales of hope, justice, and the power of treating others with dignity. Share this with someone who has been judged unfairly or felt invisible in their own life. Remind them that their worth isn't determined by people too insecure to see it. And remember that every act of kindness matters, every moment of integrity counts, and eventually the right people will recognize what the wrong people refuse to acknowledge. Keep being kind. Keep doing the next right thing, and trust that somewhere, someone is watching and seeing you clearly. Thank you for being here.